Welcome to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind. Yeah! The motion that stands before this House this evening is, ought the government have the right to interfere in education? We have some excellent speakers joining us this evening, Professor Fyfe on the proposition and Mr. Gaisford on the opposition. Before we begin the debate, I invite the clerk to read last week's minutes in the style of Mr. Starmer.
Let me be absolutely clear. Now that my children have left private school, we must close the private school tax loopholes.
Point. Sir Starmer, will this not just put more pressure on our state schools?
Welcome to Starmer's Britain.
There seems to be some disagreement in the House. We will have to take a vote by oral acclamation. All those in favour of taking the minutes as read say aye.
Aye.
And all those against say nay.
Nay!
It seems rather close. We will have to consult with my sergeant.
Aye.
The minutes are taken as read.
Aye.
Alright, it's borderline, guys. Without any further ado, I give the call to the first speaker to begin the debate this evening. Hear, hear.
So, I believe that education matters. I hope you all do too. I think we need to do our best to ensure that every child, no matter how much their parents earn, or where they live, or what they believe, should get at least some education. I don't think that we can rely on private enterprise, whether profit-seeking or non-profit seeking, or on churches or on charities to provide that universal coverage for all children. So I put it to you that if we are to provide an education for every child, not just some children, but every child, then the government is the only organisational entity that can make that happen. And we should be grateful that the government has historically interfered in education and in the educational arrangements that parents make or do not make for their children. That it has interfered in the business of charities and churches and local councils to ensure that there are enough places for every child, even in the remotest rural areas or the most overcrowded cities, to go to school. And also that it has interfered in the running of those schools to ensure that the education delivered meets at least some minimum standards. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a historian, and I've been told that this is a debate that was originally done by this society back in 1866. So you'll have to forgive me that I am going to take the historian's prerogative and think about why it was being debated in 1866, and then we can think about why it's still important today. Because back in the 1860s, the whole question of whether government should interfere in education had a slightly different meaning to it than it probably does today, and I imagine we'll go on to discuss. But in the 1860s, two things were happening. Lots of investigation of the state of public education, so that in Scotland they were in the midst of an investigative commission to investigate the state of Scottish education, which would report in another year's time, and would lead to the Education Act of 1872 in Scotland. Down south in England, they'd already had their investigative report. It was published in the early 1860s, and that was going to lead to the 1870 Education Act in England. So we're right in the midst of discussions about whether the government should intervene to provide elementary education for all children in Britain. That was why it's no surprise that the Debating Society at St Andrews was considering the question of government intervention in education. But of course, what they meant by government intervention back then may be slightly different from what we mean now. We need to understand how education was then organised and provided. You can tell from the way, what I've told you already, that it makes a slight difference whether you're in Scotland or in England. And so although our St Andrews debaters were clearly in a Scottish context, I suspect they were also very aware of the English context at the time they were talking about this. Because here in Scotland in the 1860s, there was already a well-established national system of education that had been established by legislation several centuries earlier. In fact, by the Scottish Government back when there was an original Scottish Government. The result was that here we had a school in every parish that was funded by the local taxpayers along with the minister. It meant that every parish could offer elementary education in reading and writing and arithmetic to boys and also to girls in those towns at very low fees, and they could waive the fees if there was extreme need for that to happen. And some of them also ran advanced classes in Latin and Greek and such like things. So there was, from a Scottish perspective, already a national system of education. Maybe there was no need for the government to interfere if you already have a system that seems to be working. There is, of course, a catch that it wasn't entirely working, and there was population growth in the big cities, there was a lack of qualified teachers in the rural areas. Some of these things might sound familiar to you now. So one answer then was that the government did need to intervene to update that system. And in the Scottish context, there was a history that government had already intervened. They'd intervened in 1696, and again in 1803, and again in 1838, again in 1861. So in the 1870s in Scotland, it's pretty much agreed that we expect the government to help legislate for a national system of education. The government did in the 1870s and have continued to do so to ensure that every child gets that education. But perhaps the system can always work better and be improved in some ways. But south of the border, things were rather different, because they did not have a national system of education. There was no parochial school system. They debated it back at the start of the 19th century, perhaps making sure that everyone should have 2 years of elementary education, and it had fallen in Parliament. They couldn't get agreement on it because of disagreements about religion and who should run that system. There were a lot of people from dissenting, non-conformist backgrounds who really felt that the interference of the government with education is objectionable on political and religious grounds. That was the early 19th century. By the time we get to the 1860s and they do those investigations into elementary education, they discover that there are a lot of schools around. Some of them are fee-paying, either expensive or cheap, very variable. Some places have them, some don't. Some of the schools are good, some of them aren't. And there's a lot of charity-run schools for children of the poor who can't afford. Some of them aren't bad either, but again, the coverage was very variable. You might nowadays call it postcode lottery. Not every child was getting education. They discovered that 95% of children were in school in some way. And you think, well, that's quite a good percentage, but that's 120,000 children who are getting no education still, despite the charitable provision, despite the private sector provision. And even of those who were registered at school, many of them only went for less than 100 days a year. Many of them did not stay at school until they were 12. And at least a quarter of them were in schools that the inspectors regarded as inferior and ill-calculated to provide a serviceable education. So it's quite clear that by the 1860s, education in England, without government interference, was a mess, to put it mildly. There were too many children who were not getting any education, or were getting a bad education, or not getting enough education. And so by the time we get to around about 1866, pretty much everybody who had previously opposed government interference in education had now come to the conclusion that it may or may not be desirable, but it was necessary that the government should intervene. And that is why the 1870 Education Act was finally passed. It was, of course, not the end of the story, because it didn't make education compulsory, it didn't make it free. All of that happened through further legislation later in the 19th century, and it did eventually become so. But by the end of the century, people had pretty much agreed that it was necessary for the government to interfere in parents' arrangements for their children, in the church's arrangements for schools, in factory owners' desires to have children work for them. Well, no, you can't. If they're under the age of 12, they should be in school. So there is definite interference there for the cause of education. It was seen perhaps not so much as a right to interfere, but maybe even as a duty to interfere. Now, there is, of course, a second sense in which the government might interfere in education, not just in providing that education, but in setting standards for what sort of education or the content of that education. And I imagine that might be where some of our discussion goes later this evening. And there are discussions about that in the 19th century context too, because if you're going to decide that it's important that every child gets a serviceable or worthwhile education, well, we have to agree on what that means. And clearly opinions have changed. Once upon a time, 2 years worth of reading and writing was entirely adequate. By the end of the 19th century, we were looking at 8 years, and you might actually also be expected to learn, things like history and science, and maybe some literature, and perhaps some drawing and cookery for the girls. And by the time we get to the 1940s, we've got more subjects being added to the curriculum, and you now have to stay at school until you're 16. So the government is continually interfering, and what's more, is doing things like sending around inspectors to check that the schools are actually doing this, and is laying down standards for teacher training, so that you can actually have qualified teachers in all these schools. Because there's no point building a school building if you don't actually ensure that children in it are getting a sensible sort of education. And it has taken the government's regime of inspections and qualifications and accreditation and laying down some curriculum standards to make sure that that has happened. So as long as we're discussing the provision of that universal standard education for the 5 to 16-year-olds as it is now, then I think we have to agree that government does have not just the right but the duty to interfere in providing that and in ensuring that it has whatever we currently think of as the appropriate mix of subjects. I think we can certainly debate the extent to which the government should do that itself or defer to education experts and experienced teachers nowadays. I am aware that I haven't considered here other forms of education. We are, after all in a higher education context here, and universities are also something we might think about, as of course are private schools, as are further education colleges and a whole range of other sorts of educational contexts. And I think that for those forms of education that are not part of the state-funded, state-mandated, basic, worthwhile, serviceable, whatever you want to call it, education system, then for those other parts of the education system, it is a bit more difficult to consider whether government should be allowed to interfere. Universities in this country are not entirely government run, but they have been accepting of government funding for at least the last 2 centuries and arguably longer. And it's not, I would say, unreasonable to suggest that a funder or a donor should be allowed at the very least to decide to only give their money to an institution that meets certain criteria, whatever those may be, for donors or for funders or governments. But once that money is given, do we believe that the donor or the government should also have the right to interfere in the activities of the university, especially if they're not completely running it? That is, I grant you, a more difficult proposition to deal with. And I think it's one that we may come back to in the floor debates later. But all that said, I think I for one am deeply glad that government has interfered and continues to interfere in providing education. I know too much about the inadequacies of education in the years before government did interfere to believe that there's any other sensible option. There were so many areas that had no schools or no affordable schools, or when some schools were little more than babysitting services. I think that in a world where just anybody could call themselves a teacher and turn up and run a school without necessarily providing a decent education with it, we don't want to go back to those days. And I welcome, therefore, government interference in setting the qualifications, setting the standards, and ensuring that every child gets their education until the age of 16. I don't think that even in the 21st century we can be sure that universal basic education can be better supplied by charities or by private enterprise or by other things than by government funding, inspection and oversight. So I hope you will all agree, ladies and gentlemen, that the government does have a right and indeed has a duty to ensure that every child does get an education, and it should interfere for that purpose. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their excellent address and cross the floor and give the call to the second speaker to give their address here.
Good evening, everyone. I feel a little bit lonely on this side of the room, so I hope that through my arguments that even if you don't physically cross the floor, I might have encouraged you to think not on this side. Thank you very much to the opening speaker there for lots of really interesting discussions. I hope we can come back to a number of those. I recall my first teaching job. I'm a school teacher, and I recall being shown into a room where they held in a big cupboard the original birching stick, which they used to beat children with. It wasn't in use when I started teaching. It had been outlawed a long time ago, and I want to make clear as well that I am fully in support of a number of government interventions, but which will come to when and the differences between intervention and interference shortly. So I want to start initially with a story about Marie-Thérèse Mouret, who was a visionary leader, educationalist of the 20th century. She worked at the International School of Geneva, and she saw 2 world wars, so saw through 2 world wars, witnessing firsthand the sheer devastation that ideological fanaticism and radical nationalism could unleash. So in 1948 she looked out at a shattered continent, and she sat down with another group of educators, and she wrote a treatise called Educational Techniques for Peace, Do They Exist? And her answer to that question, and to those in those Geneva educators, became the blueprint for the International Baccalaureate. This was and is an apolitical organisation designed to create citizens of the world, fostering international cooperation and critical thought. And today, the International Baccalaureate educates nearly 2 million children across the world, including 550 or so just up the road in St Leonards, where I work. And since its inception, it has been mercifully free of government interference, successfully avoiding faddish trends, politically linked grade inflation, and damaging nationalist agendas. Because the question before us tonight is not whether the government should provide an education for its citizens. That is an essential right and a responsibility. The question is whether the government has to interfere in a way that undermines educational expertise, restricts student potential, and prevents genuine innovation. So I take interference to mean unnecessary, short-sighted, or politically motivated intervention in the operation of educational systems. So I am a school teacher, and my arguments are focused on school-age education, but I do think they have applicability as well to university education too. So I'm going to focus on 3 critical pillars. Firstly, the danger of politicising the curriculum. Secondly, the dangers of the loss of autonomy and its impact on excellence. And thirdly, the power of non-governmental innovation. So, politicisation. Where the government interferes, the curriculum inevitably becomes a weapon, a tool for ideological compliance. So in Scotland, 10 years ago, the Scottish government mandated, as part of their Scots language policy, that Scottish writers must be studied at National 5 and higher levels. A good idea, you might think. The opportunity to help pupils understand their culture, their country, and their language. However, because no other set texts are mandated, writers outside of Scotland are increasingly marginalised or excluded entirely. Likewise, Michael Gove's interference in the English literature curriculum in England a decade ago has led to a generation of teenagers being put off literature for life, subjected to a tub-thumping Daily Mail-inspired version of Englishness, all Shakespeare, Dickens, bonnets, and romping around the Lake District. The result of these interferences is that children's exposure to the genuinely rich variety of the English language literature to the world outside their borders has narrowed and become parochial. Qualifications like the International Baccalaureate, by contrast, ensure students engage with global voices, broadening their horizons. But the danger is not just parochialism, it's distortion and erasure. Across history, we've seen regimes, both dark and subtle, erasing uncomfortable facts from the national curriculum. Japan is a case in point. Here, currently, the horrors and atrocities committed by the country in World War II are little spoken of, erased or minimised in national curriculum histories. Consequently, its citizens are often unaware of the shameful histories of comfort women, the rape of Nanjing. It's not harder to look further at darker regimes from the 20th century in particular, where direct interference in the curriculum was used to instill propaganda and hatred amongst the minds of citizens. Marie-Thérèse Moret, the architect of the IB, recommended that national history should be taught last, only once a broader apolitical world history had been firmly cemented. Government interference dictates the opposite. Narrow nationalism first, and political motivated interference shrinks the worldview. Secondly, the loss of autonomy and its impact on excellence. So when governments seek to control, they stifle the very engine of improvement, local autonomy. So we see a clear divergence in educational outcomes where autonomy exists. And I am no fan of the previous Conservative government in Westminster, and I've already picked a fight with Michael Gove, I don't think he's here tonight, over intervention. But one of the hard to dispute successes south of the border over the last 14 years has been the rise in internationally recognised foundational literacy and numeracy scores. And a primary driver of this success has been the greater autonomy granted to schools through the academies and multi-academy trust system. This initiative began under Tony Blair's Labour government as it accelerated under the previous Westminster government. As this room will no doubt know, education is a devolved matter. And I would say that even the most dyed-in-the-wool nationalist supporter would struggle to say the same for Scotland's education system over the last 14 years. Scotland, as a point of contrast, has a highly centralised bureaucratic system, with local authorities exercising control over schools in their patch. Heads frequently lament they are still fundamentally bound to local councils. Teachers are employed by bureaucrats who can move them around at will. They must execute council policy, often created by officials detached from the specific needs of an individual student cohort. Vision is dampened because true innovation requires the freedom to set policy, alter curriculum, and respond flexibly to the local environment. Where are the Scottish schools, for instance, who offer an alternative to the SQA exams? English academised schools, certainly until recently, with Bridget Phillipson's cruel intervention, were free to select the curriculum that best suited their pupils, their local context, to develop behaviour policies that reflected their needs, and to recruit the teachers they wanted, not those given to them by faceless bureaucrats. But this is not just about education. Time and time again, both education and business constantly show that organisations who are granted independence and autonomy are the ones that innovate, flourish and develop. So it would likely come as no surprise the countries where schools enjoy the greatest autonomy from political interference are those heroic Nordic countries, Scandinavia. They understand that 5-year political cycles do little for long-term educational improvement. And finally, I want to finish by thinking about the power of non-governmental innovation. Because innovation and government interference are, by their very nature, at odds. Government, in its drive for standardisation, is a crushing force, a dead hand. Look at some of the most innovative and disruptive educational forces throughout the 20th century. Montessori education, self-paced, child-centred. Steiner or Waldorf education, holistic, arts integrated. And I've spoken already about the International Baccalaureate, international, focusing on education for peace. These environments, born outside of state interference, are vital laboratories for change. They're able to move fast, take calculated risks, and break the mould. And they provide the foundational models that the state sector can eventually adopt after the model has been proven. Consider how quickly independent schools adopted flexible learning during the COVID-19 pandemic before the state sector followed their lead. Government interference inevitably leads to standardisation. It dulls the edges, it homogenises the content, and prevents the full, vibrant adoption of innovative models. We see this in the corporate world. The vibrant startup is bought by the massive corporation, Microsoft, the spark goes out. These behemoths, for they are, government certainly is a behemoth, they've no agility, no ability to turn, pivot and adapt. And interference stops innovation dead in its tracks or crushes it before it even gets going. So, to be clear, the government has a duty to educate its citizens, a fundamental duty, and it must set standards of accountability and ensure equity. I have no issue with school inspections, and I'll come back to them perhaps in my rebuttal. What it must resist, however, is the instinct to interfere in the daily operations. So you've heard about politicisation shrinking and distorting curriculums. You've heard how the loss of autonomy centralises failure, prevents local vision. And you've heard how the most innovative and progressive models in education are born and they thrive only when the government keeps its interference at arm's length. I'm not asking the government to abandon education. I'm asking it to trust the experts, respect the vision, and allow the citizens of the future to be educated by professionals, not by politicians. It has a right to demand accountability, but it has no right to dictate uniformity. For the sake of progress, innovation, our children's future, the motion must be defeated. Interference must stop. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker for their excellent address, and it is now time to bring the debate to the floor, which means the audience. So anyone in attendance can give a speech. Because we have some spare time this evening, speeches can be up to 2 minutes in length. If you want to give a speech, please raise your hand nice and high. We have a reasonable amount of time, so don't be dissuaded if I don't call on you first. Please keep raising your hand. We also have a collection of minutes that goes back over 200 years, and we're very proud of our minutes. And if you want your name to be entered along with what you say, then please state your name nice and clearly so we can make a note of that and make a note of your speech. So without any further ado, do we have any speeches from the floor? Yes.
For the minutes, my name is Francesca Taylor. I would like to bring attention to a recent news issue, and that's in regards to higher education, and that's the Chinese government intercession into research into their human rights abuses. I'm concerned that if the UK government does not interfere in higher education and maintains freedom of information and access, and maintains our right to criticise regimes such as China, that other governments will instead interfere. The Chinese government did not just interfere by going after doing the talks at the university. They also made several complaints to the insurance companies, meaning that the universities were unable to have their professors insured for research. I'm concerned that if we enable education to be fully up for the private sector, we'll have more and more cases of foreign governments complaining to private sectors and preventing research. I believe that the government needs to interfere. Otherwise, the UK's research and critique of the very things that go against UK principles will be at risk. If we do not allow, and the government has a right and a need to interfere, the cases like this are surely to increase. The government themselves have condemned this. They are investigating it under terrorism charges, and I believe that this should be maintained. But if we go with the idea that the government has no right to interfere in education, then this would enable the Chinese governments, and we could say Russia or Iran or any other government international government that disagrees with the UK, to interfere. And we must be protective of our education system, for it's a strong education system. We can't let that go to waste. Thank you.
Sorry, I realise I forgot to mention there is also a prize for the best floor speech, which is just decided between ourselves. And I believe this week the prize is a £15 voucher to Topping's Bookshop. So a suitable prize indeed. So if you would like to be in contention for winning that prize, then please give a floor speech. We'll go with at the back. Yeah.
My name is Leonardo. And today I find myself in a very rare position where in a debate I agree entirely with both sides. Of course, I agree with the proposition that the government should provide education for everyone, and I do believe that the government is the only body that is able to do so efficiently and at the massive scale that we need it. But understandably, I also fully support the opposition statement that the government shouldn't interfere too much and shouldn't politicize it. I grew up in Moscow, in Russia, where right now the curriculum of middle school and high school is entirely controlled by the government. All information that is not suitable for the regime is excluded from the curriculum. Silent aggressions, for instance, are not taught in schools across Russia. I was lucky enough to be enrolled in an international baccalaureate school, which I think was really great and shaped me into the person that I am now. However, I also understand that the vast majority of people in Russia and anywhere around the world cannot afford this type of education. So my concern about the opposition statement is that we need government education, we need government interference to provide affordable education, first of all. Second of all, even when there's no government interference in a curriculum, the curriculum is still decided by some kind of centralized body. The International Baccalaureate still has a hierarchy, and the curriculum and the exams are decided by this group of people, which is centralized. And this centralized body is bound to have some kind of its own biases and its own shortcomings. So there's always going to be some intervention from a certain higher body. And whether or not that's the government or some people in Geneva, there's still going to be an inherent bias in any kind of group. So I'm not sure there is a solution to avoid interference in education. Thank you.
We'll go with Mia.
My name's Mia. Let's say at the start, I am myself, I would describe it, a victim of the Scottish education system. I am all too familiar with the way that the Scottish Government's prioritisation of particular forms of academic success has meant that often state schools, such as the one that I attended, have failed to accurately prioritise the ability of students to attain academic qualifications. I myself was forced to split my time between 2 schools in the final year of my higher education in order to access the qualifications that I needed to be able to apply to the course I do at this university. So I'm well aware that government policy can change the way that education happens in a way which is not often favourable. But it is important to remember that the alternative in this debate isn't a world in which we can always rely on very favourable, very charitable individuals to set up policies such as the international baccalaureate system. I'm very pleased that this is a system which has workable alternatives. But what happens when you have a system that is set up by an individual who is involved in education, who does not have the perfect clear consciousness as the individuals who may have designed the systems that we're familiar with today? At least when the SNP creates educational policy, I'm able to go to the ballot box and vote them out if I think that I disagree with it. It is not a situation which exists in a world in which we don't allow the government to have the right to interfere. As in individuals, we may sometimes be able to trust to act favourably, but oftentimes we can't. I would infinitely prefer a situation in which we have the ability to hold those who set our educational policy to account if we disagree with it, than one in which we have to be beholden to the individual people who set curriculums in order to act favourably. And that's why I stand with the proposition in this debate. Thank you.
Do you have any further speeches? Yes.
For the record, my name is Aileen Fyfe. I find myself in a peculiar and fortunate position to have attended the very school where the International Baccalaureate originated. However, I know that there are many people in the world who did not have the opportunity to go to a school like this, and even within those who attend private schools, ones nominally independent from severe intervention and interference from the government, they remain limited in how they can educate these children. While the International Baccalaureate is a good system in my eyes of educating children, there are private systems, and I think particularly of religious education, where students are not provided with a complete education, one which gives them opportunities to pursue whatever they may wish in life. Schools which focus too much perhaps on the study of religious texts instead of a diversity of skills and knowledge required to succeed in the modern day. The example brought forth by the opposition is pertinent in my eyes to this debate, but I fear it may be also a case of slight cherry picking. There are cases, I would like to draw the attention of the House to the wording. It is whether the government ought to have the right to interfere in education and not necessarily to interfere with it every single day of the week. And there are, in my eyes, cases where private education fails the fundamental right of every human being to gain an education which is befitting of their dignity as human beings. Thank you.
For the record, my name is Amy Campbell. I was born and raised in Oklahoma. It's you know Texas, the one north of it, in the States, which is a completely Republican state. And many years ago, I would have 100% agreed with the right to interfere in education. I believe the government definitely should have had control with that. But I said that when my state was 17th in education. My state is now 49th in education. One of the largest reasons is government intervention. It is now illegal to teach the Tulsa Race Massacre, which is one of the most deadly things to happen in my state, fueled by the KKK and many other racist actions. Additionally, our universities are also controlled by the government. My research that I did in my undergrad is now illegal to research in the state of Oklahoma because it's DEI. I would love for the government in a perfect world to allow everyone to have a strong education. However, I have to side with the opposition tonight, seeing the downside of having the government deep into our education system. Many people in Oklahoma are now illiterate because we are not properly taught the correct way to educate because of Common Core. Common Core does not properly teach to the age of the development age of them. It teaches to what the government wanted them to teach. And so for this, I have to say I'm going with the opposition.
You ready for the speeches? Yes, in the front row.
I don't really speak. I just wanted to report what Pascal spoke because I find the point about the Chinese government interfering in the UK research is kind of irrelevant because I don't think this instance is the UK government really interfering in education, but rather just protecting us from foreign threats. And I don't think we should use like the threat of like foreign governments who like we're not friendly with like China or Russia or whatever as a way of saying, oh yes, the government should have the right to interfere in education. I just find it kind of really irrelevant.
Yes.
So my point is sort of much less important than many of the others have already said. My point applies specifically to the standardization of education, which was brought up by the opposition as a negative thing, as sort of this dull and drab reality that stifles inventiveness, as I think what was said. So while I agree that that is certainly a way it can manifest in many schools, as well as universities, it can dull some children's uniqueness. I do also think that there's some thought to be had about standardization as being a necessary element of education, at least to a certain point. This is because we all grow up to live in a certain kind of society, right? So there should be some kind of base level education that we all get that is at least on some level similar. Now this brings me to the Montessori schools, which you've also mentioned. I'm from Poland, and in Poland we had this kind of boom of Montessori schools. I have many friends in those schools who now cannot go on to further education even though they want to, because the education they've gotten from those schools simply doesn't allow for that. They don't have the skills to, I don't know, write an essay. They haven't read many of the books required, say, in state education or even many private schools. I wouldn't say that it's a terrible system to have a Montessori school, but this is just like a consequence that I have encountered. And so these are now people who cannot fully be integrated into society because of the education that they have. So maybe there's something to be said about standardization in education being necessary, at least to a certain degree. And maybe governmental education is the only kind of education which can happen on a fully standardized, equal level, and allow all children of all income, all places of residence in a certain country to receive the same equal level of education and to have the same opportunities in later life. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yes, at the back. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Nelia, as in Cornelia, and I have around 3 points to point out here. First of all, we were kind of equating government interfering in education as political and government not interfering in education as apolitical. But then, from my perspective, it's just a matter of what kind of political. For example, I don't really know a lot of people who did the international school curriculum because I myself did not have the opportunity to do that. But one person who told me about her exam was like the IB English AHL. Like there was kind of like compulsory books that they had to read. First one is 1984, second is Animal Farm, and the third is the Crucible. And they are political books. And so it's just a matter of like what kind of political. And I think when we're talking about the English language, it's super lucky that so many different places, many people are speaking English. Because in my own region, I would say Hong Kong, not a lot of people speak through English. And so our English exam would just be like grammar exams instead of like examining texts. However, so that's the first point, like kinds of political. The second point is that from my perspective, giving the government the right to interfere with education is just a slippery slope towards government total control. I would say I might not use totalitarianism to describe it yet, but then it's a slippery slope. For example, in Hong Kong, the Chinese government have had the opportunity to intervene with our education for years. However, they did the biggest change around 3 years ago, and I was the first year to experience that. They scraped the entire subject for critical thinking and replace it with Chinese national security law entirely. And the proportion of marks that counters my university entrance exam, they are the same. However, instead of learning how to think, we're just memorizing national security laws, national flag laws, national anthem laws, and things like that. And what we do would end us up in prison, and how we can avoid that. And so, given this opportunity for the government to do things like this, I would rather have the government not have the right to interfere in education. The third thing is that I think this is a bit I think it as something similar to the real estates versus the democratic states. Like the real estates, they all think of each other as wanting to attack them, and they have to protect themselves. Hence the first comment about the British government having to protect British schools from influence from the Chinese government. And I get that totally. But then why would I be worried? And that is because of the idea of maybe it's something connected to democratic peace theory, where if other states are democratic, you would trust them to be democratic and not have war with you. So I think it all boils down to this kind of realist versus democratic states. Thank you.
Any further speeches? Yes, we'll go Alex.
Yeah, I hope you know my name, Jamie. Right, well, I'll start off by quoting a historian, Tony Judd, who said, it's right of the HI 2001 reading list, so I hope you approve, Professor Fyfe, that, history can never be completely apolitical. And that is, or not rather completely, it cannot be apolitical, period. And I remember very well when the curriculum of Greek schools back home was changed to present an apolitical version of our civil war in the 1940s. And I have to tell you that it caused a huge uproar, and reading it again, I think last year, it really did whitewash a lot of the crimes of the communists. It's plain as day that national history, or as a matter of fact international history, cannot be taught in an apolitical way because there is no such thing. And it's also, I think, quite pointless to assume that education happens in a vacuum. You grow up in a society, in a political society, and you need to, and that comes along with certain attitudes and debates that change. And unfortunately, there are societies that prosper, there are times of prosperity, both intellectually, economically, socially, etc., and also times of decline. So, things like the things mentioned around the intervention of the US government into education, it really reflects ongoing debates and social conditions. If the government didn't interfere, there would be other sort of points of tension in the research that was happening, as it were, that would need to be resolved somehow. Now, I'm not in favor of these sorts of interventions, but it is just fact that they would rear their ugly heads, these tensions, somehow. So quite frankly, especially looking at primary and secondary education, they are also a nation-building process, and they should be. And as such, the government should have some leeway into interfering into the curriculum. Now, I'm also a graduate of the IB, very proud of it, but it was only the last 2 years of my education. And I also have to say that going through that, my ability to use my mother tongue declined drastically. So it just goes to say that national education should be something that we put attention into, political as well as experts, and as such, the government should have the right to interfere in the education and the curriculum specifically. Thank you.
Any further speeches? Yes.
For the minutes, my name is Max Strauss. I'm mostly concerned with regional inequality, and I put it to the opposition that if we were to not intervene in and interfere in education, how we would prevent the growing divide in regional inequality. When we're a country where, or in England at least, south of the border, twice as many schools in the West Midlands are rated as inadequate, and children are many times less likely to leave school in the North East with the same number of high-level A-levels as they would in the South East. If we aren't to interfere in that curriculum, I worry that the divide in education that is offered in less affluent parts of the country will become more of a chasm. If schools are allowed to decide what they teach based on their resources to teach that information, how we prevent less affluent students from less affluent backgrounds getting a lower quality of education.
Fantastic. Any further speeches?
Hi, I'm Owen. I guess I'll make the point that I think in some ways we've been a little bit too idealistic about like what education can be. Like, yes, it can be big things about kind of, you know, international politics and peace theory and things like that. But I think for the vast majority of people, the most sort of immediate impact of education for them is just like whether or not they get a job at the end of the day. And I think in these ways, I think private education can become quite harmful to that, in the sense that a lot of things that we are taught in education, I do value the things that we are taught in education, particularly in an age of misinformation and things like that. I think the ability to think is really important. But in terms of the actual skills that then transfers onto most jobs that a lot of people will do, they don't necessarily always correspond. And in a way then that makes education somewhat zero-sum. If you've got like two sets of people and you start educating one person and they get better, that's not better, like that's not a net improvement, that's a disimprovement for the other people who are now have comparatively less ability to achieve qualifications for the job that they want to go to. So improving education by having like, I guess, more private and less government, if you want to think of the debate in that terms, maybe that's not quite the best way to think about it because it's a rights debate, but I think that private education can be harmful in that way because of that zero-sum element.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions to the floor. I think that's one of my favorite series of floor speeches that we've had this year. So thank you for such an interesting and sort of geographically diverse, at the very least, set of perspectives. It's now time to bring the debate back to the dispatch boxes, starting with the opposition.
Well, thanks everyone. I feel I've got so much to respond to, so I really want to try and take on so many of the things that everyone said, and so fantastic to have such diversity, I think, in terms of educational experience. What I really want to say is that I don't want to get distracted by a couple of points here. We've talked quite a lot about sort of private schools and independent schools. I'm talking about the concept of independence, so I don't really want to get into a debate, into a very separate debate, which I'm sure you will have or have had, about the existence of private schools. What I'm interested in really is autonomy, the ability of schools to direct their own policy. So I'm to pick up from the opening speaker there. There are a number of two I words used quite frequently, sort of interchangeably, and I want to just drill down and dispute a bit of those. So we talked about intervention, but the question, the other I we have here is interference. And I want to make it absolutely crystal clear that I am in no way proposing that government should not intervene in education. government absolutely has a fundamental right and a responsibility to provide an education for its citizens, and it must do that, and it needs to intervene at times. We had the point there in the floor about the postcode lottery, the regional inequality. Well, absolutely, I completely agree with you, and I would desperately want the government to intervene in that state. Scotland here has some pretty shocking, inefficient outcomes with a highly centralised and bureaucratic state. Some of the most impressive outcomes down south in England have been schools that have broken free. Controversial one, you might have heard of it. The Michaela School in northwest London has some of the highest achievements of pupils and the highest achieving state schools with some of the most deprived pupil intake. And it's been able to do that because it can set entirely the policies and the systems that it needs for those pupils to succeed in their area. So that's got the highest social mobility score of any school in England. Bringing up a few of the points that we heard about the terrorism law and government into Chinese intervention. Again, obviously if anything legal is happening, I want the government to intervene if there are charges to be brought. And that's not to say that universities or schools are somehow places where the government cannot intervene in any way. We've spoken already about safeguarding and beating children. I'm in no way an advocate for some kind of free-for-all where we can do whatever we like. I appreciated very much hearing from the IB graduate from Moscow, and you may well be aware that Russia has just banned the International Baccalaureate because it sees it as a dangerous curriculum, as does Bridget Phillipson, who's also looked to do the same in state schools in England. And if you would like to save the IB in state schools in England, there is a campaign going currently. I also completely agree with everyone who suggested that the curriculum is a political act. Absolutely. You cannot put together a list of set texts without exercising some political choice. But I would add, as a teacher of English A higher level, actually there are the set texts, you have a completely free hit of whatever you'd like to teach. So yes, it's a political act, but it becomes the teacher's political act in their area, reflecting their students. So I've taught Dante, I've taught Baudelaire, I've taught Ibsen, and I've taught all manner of texts. So it is a political act, I take that. What it avoids is the knee-jerk political interference. So case in point, Rishi Sunak in his dying days of his premiership a few years ago announced back of a fag packet, everyone's studying maths to A level or to post 16. Okay, classic knee-jerk reaction, goes in. Bridget Phillipson comes in, scraps that. She also scraps things like the English baccalaureate, confusing lots of baccalaureates. That these are, regardless of whether you think they are brilliant or poor initiatives, the fact that politicians think in 5-term cycles when it comes to education, the education of our young people, is deeply, deeply problematic. It deserves much deeper thought and care rather than being brushed off from one month to the next. So I do want accountability and I do want minimum standards. I don't want schools and education systems left unexamined. But that accountability needs to be an intelligent accountability. And it's a skillful art of the government recognising when it needs to intervene, such as shockingly poor regional inequalities. I'd love the government to intervene in Scottish education, properly intervene, and then step back and then pull back. But it needs that intervention. What it can't then do is drift into interference. So, ultimately, I think this is beyond beyond education. I go back to my second point, that ultimately it is through autonomy that people and schools and systems are able to innovate, adapt and improve. And there is a tipping point where a government needs to recognise that actually it's moving beyond intervention, necessary, to interference, unnecessary. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their excellent address, and now we cross the floor once again and give the call to the proposition speaker to conclude the debate. Hear, hear.
So thank you all. It has been fascinating to hear all the different perspectives brought to this debate tonight. I'm actually slightly surprised that we have stuck with school education and not gone that far into higher education, which I think could have opened up a whole new can of worms. I think that it's really what we're here trying to work out how to find the balance. In the 19th century world, interference meant just intervention. But of course, when we're talking in the 21st century world, we're now talking about interference being undue interference, not merely intervention. And so from a 19th century point of view, or an 1866 point of view, I think it is quite clear that it seems to me there's a balance in the House for the government should intervene and interfere in education to ensure that it is provided universally across all regions to everybody. But then we come to that other definition. Should the government be able to interfere on a daily basis, a weekly basis, or whatever? Should political changes, political fashions affect the curriculum as much as they do in some places? And when I was musing on this before, I was thinking, if I'm going to argue that the government should have a right to interfere in education, then what do I think about Afghanistan's government's decision not to educate half of its citizens? I don't feel very happy about that. But if I am to argue that the government has no right at all, then I get tied up in knots as well. I think we have to accept the government does have the right, and unfortunately that does mean that the government has the right to decide that it doesn't want to educate half its citizens, even if we don't agree with it. I think the problem there is greater than the one about education. The problem is not whether the government in Afghanistan has the right to do that or not. The problem is whether the government of Afghanistan is representing all of its citizens and trying to do good things for all of its citizens. And it's not really a question about its right to interfere in education. And I presume we could make a version of that work for some other places. I think the fact that governments in many countries are accountable to their populations is an important point and is something that we want, and we have to hope that eventually governments that we personally don't approve of may move on. But it is a tricky one when you think of all the examples we can all think of where there have been short-term political decisions that you kind of wish hadn't happened, or that don't agree with my beliefs or your beliefs or whoever's they are today. We all have different views on that. And of course, the challenging is that views about what an appropriate education is, they are political in change, but also they have changed over time. The very fact that it used to be thought that it was okay just to give you 2 years of reading and writing, and that would be fine. And now we're asking for education to 16, or perhaps even education to 18. And we're looking at a whole range of different subjects. In the recent government review in England is discussing things like not just having moral and philosophical education and personal and social and sex education, but also citizenship and digital literacy. And there's more and more things that might perhaps be added to the curriculum. You can see that as a necessary updating. You can see there is a sense to that. It may be political fad, or it may be in fact important updating, and how do we tell that difference? I think it is a challenge for us all to think about. We want, I think, the government to intervene, to provide. We want the government to provide the minimum standards and the accountability and the inspections. And yet somehow we would also surely like some of the autonomy, but not too much, probably, depending on your view. And we don't want the frequent interference, but we do want the ability to have some interference. So I think there's no doubt that the government should have the right to interfere in education, and I hope you're all with me on that. What we would ideally need to do is the next phase and decide how do you draw the line against too much interference. But this motion is simply, does the government have the right, should the government have the right to interfere? And I think that has to be yes, it does.
Thank you to the speakers, and indeed thank you to all members of the House for what has been a fantastic debate. And now it's time to call the House to a vote. So please raise your hand nice and high and keep it up if you side with the proposition, that is, you do believe the government as above. And if you side with the opposition,
Presumably you're also voting for yourself.
Oh yes, I do.
And do we have any abstentions? Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Do we have any announcements from the board? Yes, Ariel.
First of all, if you enjoyed that debate and would like to keep talking about it, we have our weekly social at Eden Bar after this. Please come along, come have a conversation. More excitingly, next weekend is our ball, 1794. You will be excited. If you're not now, you will by the end of this. If you're interested in coming along, our tickets are still available on our own website. So you don't have to navigate any annoying union sites or Fixer accounts. And we are looking at a ball that has a K, a musician, a DJ, and it's Jane Austen themed and includes a prize for best dress. So if any of this interests you, or you have found yourself devastated by being unable to get Christmas ball tickets, but still wish to go to a ball this year, please come to 1794, and it'll be a good bit of fun, and great to see the amount of work my subcommittee has put into it and sharing it. So I can't wait to see you there. Thank you.
Do you have any further announcements from board? Yes, Beata.
Thank you very much to our wonderful speakers. It has been an absolutely fantastic debate. If you would like to see more of this, we do these every week on Thursdays, right here for the rest of the semester. Next week's debate, I believe, will be "This House believes that the internet is to blame for the male loneliness epidemic." So we'd love to see as many of you there as, Thank you very much.
Do we have any further announcements? Fantastic. So it's now time to announce the results of the debate. For the proposition, the ayes to the right were 32, and for the opposition, the nays to the left were 23, with 5 abstentions. Therefore, the ayes have it. The ayes have it.